In the final months of the First World War, as Europe's battlefields lay scarred by artillery craters and tangled wire, military planners across the world were already thinking about the next war. Trenches had proven that machine guns ruled the battlefield, yet something had become painfully clear. Existing rifle-caliber machine guns were not enough. German forces had introduced armored aircraft and improved ground protection. Steel plates were appearing on vehicles. Infantry units were learning how to use cover more effectively. Standard .30 caliber rounds could suppress, but they could not reliably penetrate light armor. The United States Army understood this weakness after studying combat reports from Europe in 1918. They needed something heavier, something that could punch through steel. At the center of this search stood one man, John Browning. By the time the war was ending, Browning was already one of the most respected firearms designers in the world. He had designed pistols, rifles, and machine guns that were widely adopted by the U.S. military. But now, the Army Ordnance Department approached him with a new challenge. They wanted a weapon capable of destroying aircraft and penetrating armored targets at long range. The concept was simple in theory: scale up the existing Browning machine gun design to fire a much larger cartridge. In practice, this required solving enormous engineering problems. A heavier round meant higher pressures. Higher pressures meant stronger components, and stronger components meant more weight. At first, the Army experimented with adapting existing weapons. Early prototypes struggled, barrels overheated, receivers cracked, feeding mechanisms jammed under the stress of the powerful new cartridge. Engineers quickly realized that this would not be a minor modification. It would require an entirely new class of weapon. The cartridge itself was revolutionary. The .50 caliber Browning machine gun round, later known as the 50 BMG, measured 12.7 by 99 millimeters. It was inspired partly by German anti-tank ammunition encountered during the war. The new American round was capable of traveling at high velocity while carrying immense kinetic energy. In early tests, it could punch through nearly an inch of steel at close range. That was unheard of for a machine gun. Browning went back to his workshop and began refining the design. He enlarged the basic short recoil operating system of his earlier machine guns. The receiver was reinforced, the bolt was strengthened, the barrel was thickened to withstand heat and pressure. Every component had to endure forces far greater than those generated by standard rifle-caliber weapons. In 1919, test models were submitted for evaluation. The Army subjected them to brutal trials. Thousands of rounds were fired in rapid succession. Weapons were dropped, overheated, and exposed to dirt and mud. Failures were studied carefully. Parts were redesigned. The process was relentless. By 1921, the weapon had matured into what would officially be adopted as the Browning .50 caliber machine gun. Over the following decade, further improvements refined it into the version that would become legendary, the M2 Browning. One of the most important modifications was the addition of a heavy barrel configuration. This allowed the gun to sustain longer bursts without overheating. It also improved accuracy at extended ranges. With an effective range exceeding 1,800 meters against point targets and much farther for area suppression, the M2 was not merely a support weapon, it was a battlefield dominator. The United States military began mounting the M2 on almost anything that could carry it. Early anti-aircraft platforms used twin and quad configurations. Naval vessels installed it to defend against aircraft and small boats. Tanks received it as a secondary weapon. Even infantry units, though burdened by its weight, learned to deploy it in defensive positions. What made the M2 different was not just its size, but its reliability. Browning's genius lay in simplicity and durability. The weapon could function in extreme heat and bitter cold. It could endure sand, rain, and rough handling. Soldiers found that once it was properly head-spaced and timed, a process requiring care but easily learned, it would fire with remarkable consistency. In the interwar years, many nations experimented with heavy machine guns, but few achieved the balance of power, durability, and mechanical reliability that the M2 offered. By the late 1930s, as Europe drifted once more toward war, the United States possessed a weapon that was decades ahead of many of its contemporaries. When World War II erupted in 1939, the M2 was ready. Though America would not officially enter the conflict until 1941, production had already begun to expand. Factories ramped up output. Skilled workers machined receivers from solid steel blocks. Barrels were forged, rifled, and tested under intense quality control standards. Each completed weapon represented industrial power transformed into firepower. The M2 was heavy, over 80 pounds without its tripod, but its weight was a symbol of its strength. This was not a gun meant to be carried lightly across a battlefield. It was meant to anchor a position, to dominate an airfield, to sit atop a tank turret and command the horizon. In early field exercises, American soldiers were stunned by what the weapon could do. Test targets made of steel plate were shredded, light vehicles were torn apart, aircraft fuselage mock-ups were ripped open by sustained bursts. The thunderous report of the .50 caliber round echoed across training grounds, deeper and more violent than any standard machine gun. The psychological effect was immediate, even in peacetime training. Troops understood that this was not just another weapon, it was a force multiplier. Against aircraft, it created lethal zones in the sky. Against infantry, it could punch through cover that once offered protection. Against vehicles, it rendered thin armor nearly meaningless. Yet perhaps the most important aspect of the M2's birth was timing. The weapon matured precisely as warfare itself was changing. Aircraft were becoming faster and more numerous. Mechanized divisions relied on trucks and lightly armored transports. The battlefield was no longer confined to trenches. It was mobile, fluid, and mechanized. The M2 fit this new world perfectly. When the United States entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor, thousands of M2s were already in service. Production accelerated even further. By war's end, hundreds of thousands would be manufactured. They would be mounted on ships crossing the Atlantic, bombers flying over Europe, tanks rolling through North Africa, and landing craft approaching hostile shores. But in those early years, before its fearsome reputation had spread, the M2 was simply the product of careful engineering and hard lessons learned from the First World War. It was born not from cruelty, but from necessity, a response to armor, a response to aircraft, a response to a changing battlefield. John Browning himself would not live to see the full impact of his creation. He passed away in 1926, yet his design endured. It would outlast the war it was built for. It would outlast the soldiers who first fired it, and it would become one of the longest-serving military weapons in history. The birth of the M2 Browning marked the beginning of a new era in firepower. It was the answer to a problem that modern warfare had exposed. And as the world once again descended into global conflict, this heavy machine gun stood ready, silent, waiting, and built to change the battlefield forever. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the M2 Browning was no longer an experimental design. It was ready for war. What followed would transform it from a powerful weapon into a battlefield legend, one that German soldiers would come to recognize instantly by sound alone. The first large-scale combat deployments of the M2 occurred in North Africa in 1942. American forces landing during Operation Torch encountered experienced German units from the Afrika Korps. The desert battlefield was wide open, long sight lines, little natural cover, and constant mechanized movement. It was the perfect environment for a heavy machine gun with extreme range and penetrating power. Mounted on half-tracks, trucks, and defensive emplacements, the M2 quickly demonstrated its value. German supply vehicles, often lightly armored or completely unarmored, were vulnerable at distances where rifle-caliber machine guns were ineffective. The 50-caliber round could punch through engine blocks, disable transport columns, and neutralize machine gun nests behind cover. Veterans later recalled the first time they saw what a 50-caliber round could do to a vehicle. Radiators exploded, tires shredded instantly, thin armor plates cracked under sustained fire. At long range, the weapon delivered not just suppression, but destruction. But it was not only on the ground that the M2 proved devastating. American bombers flying over Europe, including the B-17 and B-24, carried multiple M2 machine guns in powered turrets. German fighter pilots attacking these formations soon learned that closing in on a bomber was far more dangerous than expected. Each bomber bristled with 50-caliber guns capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. When formations overlapped their fields of fire, the sky itself seemed filled with tracer streams. German pilots described flying into what felt like walls of fire. The heavy rounds could tear through engine cowlings and cockpit armor. A single burst could cripple an aircraft. The M2's high muzzle velocity made it especially deadly against fast-moving targets. It gave American bombers a fighting chance deep inside hostile airspace. On the Western Front, after D-Day in 1944, the M2 became even more visible. Mounted atop Sherman tanks, it served as both an anti-aircraft and anti-infantry weapon. Tank commanders stood exposed in their turrets, gripping the spade handles of the heavy machine gun. When German infantry attempted ambushes from hedgerows in Normandy, the 50 caliber often answered. The thick bocage terrain of France created brutal close-quarters fighting. German troops relied on concealment, firing from behind stone walls and dense vegetation. Standard small arms could suppress these positions, but the M2 could penetrate them. Stone walls crumbled, trees splintered. Defensive positions that once offered safety became vulnerable. Its sound became infamous. Unlike the rapid, almost tearing fabric noise of the German MG-42, the M2 fired with a slower, deeper rhythm. Each shot carried a heavy, concussive crack that echoed across fields and towns. Soldiers described it as deliberate and powerful, less a chatter, more a hammering force. German troops learned to identify that sound quickly. Reports from captured soldiers revealed a particular respect for American 50 caliber positions. They knew that light cover would not stop it. Even vehicles were not safe if caught in the open. In urban fighting, the M2's effectiveness continued. During battles in cities like Aachen, it was used to clear fortified buildings. Sustained bursts could chip away at brick and concrete. Windows, doors, and barricades offered little resistance. The weapon's range also allowed it to dominate long streets and open squares. Naval warfare provided yet another stage. American destroyers and landing craft were equipped with M2 machine guns to defend against aircraft and small attack boats. During amphibious assaults, including those in the Pacific and Europe, gunners stood behind their weapons as incoming fire and shrapnel filled the air. The M2 provided immediate defensive firepower during the vulnerable moments of landing operations. In the Pacific theater, its impact was equally profound. Japanese aircraft conducting low-level attacks were met with intense 50 caliber fire. The heavy round's range and striking power made it effective against lightly built aircraft. On island battlefields, Marines mounted M2s to defend airstrips and beachheads, using their range to control open terrain. Yet beyond its physical destruction, the M2's reputation grew because of reliability. In mud, snow, desert sand, and tropical humidity, it kept firing. Properly maintained, it endured conditions that would cripple lesser weapons. Soldiers trusted it, and in combat, trust was everything. German intelligence took note of its widespread deployment. Unlike specialized weapons limited to certain units, the M2 seemed everywhere, on tanks, on trucks, on aircraft, on ships. Its versatility multiplied its presence across every front where American forces fought. There were also tactical consequences. German infantry units often had to adjust their movement patterns. Open field advances became riskier. Light reconnaissance vehicles could not assume safety at distance. Even strafing American positions from low altitude became a gamble when 50 caliber guns were present. For American forces, the weapon provided psychological confidence. Gunners understood that they possessed something capable of overwhelming force. Many after-action reports describe situations where a single well-positioned M2 halted enemy advances or destroyed critical equipment. As the war progressed into 1945 and Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, the heavy machine gun remained a constant presence. From the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes, its silhouette, long barrel, boxy receiver, mounted on tripod or turret, became symbolic of American firepower. By the end of the war, the M2 was no longer simply a heavy machine gun. It had become a battlefield icon. German soldiers did not merely encounter it, they anticipated it. They listened for it, and when they heard its deep measured thunder in the distance, they understood what it meant. The weapon born from the lessons of World War I had found its proving ground. On land, at sea, and in the air, the M2 Browning demonstrated why it was more than just steel and mechanics. It was reach, it was power, and for those facing it across the battlefield, it was a sound that carried a message. Nothing in sight was truly safe. By 1943, German forces were known for their engineering. Their tanks were feared, their machine guns were respected, their discipline was hardened by years of war. But even with this reputation, there was one reality they could not escape. Much of their equipment was never designed to withstand sustained 50 caliber fire from the M2 Browning. On paper, Germany possessed some of the most formidable armored vehicles of World War II. Heavy tanks like the Tiger and Panther dominated headlines and battlefield reports. Yet those massive machines represented only a fraction of the vehicles actually operating across Europe. The majority of German mobility depended on trucks, half-tracks, light reconnaissance vehicles, and supply transports, and those were vulnerable. The 50 BMG round fired from the M2 carried enormous kinetic energy. At close and medium ranges, it could penetrate light armor plating, especially the thin side and rear sections common on transport vehicles. German SDKFZ half-tracks used to move infantry and tow artillery were armored primarily against small arms fire. They were not built to absorb repeated heavy caliber impacts. American after-action reports from North Africa and later from France describe 50 caliber fire disabling German vehicles with shocking speed. Engines were shattered, fuel tanks ruptured, tires and suspension systems were destroyed. Even when armor was not fully penetrated, spalling, metal fragments breaking loose inside the vehicle, could injure or kill crew members. German soldiers quickly realized that mobility itself had become dangerous under American observation. The vulnerability extended beyond transport vehicles. Anti-aircraft crews operating light flak guns were often exposed, were shielded only by thin plates. When American forces gained air superiority and began pushing across open terrain, M2-equipped vehicles could suppress or destroy these positions from beyond the effective range of many German infantry weapons. The psychological impact was significant. troops trained to rely on cover discovered that certain forms of protection were suddenly unreliable. Wooden structures, brick walls, sandbag fortifications. These might stop rifle fire, but the heavy .50 caliber round often tore through them. In defensive engagements, German soldiers learned to dig deeper, reinforce more heavily, and avoid exposing vehicles unnecessarily. Even aircraft were not immune. German ground attack pilots flying low-level missions faced a growing threat from American formations bristling with M2 machine guns. Strafing runs required altitude sacrifice for accuracy, but flying low meant entering the lethal envelope of concentrated .50 caliber fire. The high velocity of the round reduced the need for large lead corrections, making it effective against fast-moving targets. Captured German pilot accounts describe the difficulty of attacking bomber formations protected by multiple heavy machine guns. A fighter closing in on a B-17 or B-24 faced intersecting streams of .50 caliber fire. A few hits to an engine, fuel line, or cockpit could be catastrophic. But the ground war revealed another layer of vulnerability. As Allied forces advanced after D-Day, German defensive doctrine relied heavily on ambush tactics. Infantry would position themselves in forests, behind hedgerows, or inside stone buildings. These methods had worked effectively against lighter weapons, yet the M2's power altered the equation. Tank commanders often used their mounted .50 caliber guns to prep suspected ambush positions. Rather than sending infantry forward immediately, they saturated tree lines and building facades with heavy fire. The effect was both physical and psychological. Trees splintered violently under repeated hits, masonry chipped and fractured. The volume and impact of fire made concealment less secure. German troops could not assume that distance alone would protect them. The M2's effective range exceeded that of many standard infantry weapons. American units positioned on elevated terrain could dominate open ground, preventing German movements during daylight hours. This forced tactical adaptation. German units increasingly relied on nighttime maneuver, thicker fortifications, and heavier armor deployment. Yet heavy armor was limited. Tanks required fuel, maintenance, and safe supply routes that were themselves vulnerable to .50 caliber interdiction. There was also the issue of logistics. Germany's war effort depended on moving ammunition, food, and reinforcements across contested territory. Convoys traveling roads within range of American armored patrols faced constant risk. A single M2 mounted on a jeep or half-track could disrupt supply lines effectively. Unlike artillery, which required coordination and ammunition stockpiles, the M2 was mobile and responsive. It could be repositioned quickly. It could engage immediately, and it required far fewer resources to operate. German commanders understood that they were not facing merely another machine gun. They were confronting a weapon that blurred the line between infantry support and anti-material firepower. When compared to Germany's own iconic machine gun, the MG-42, the difference became clear. The MG-42 was devastating in its rate of fire, capable of overwhelming infantry positions, but it fired a rifle-caliber cartridge. Its strength lay in suppression and volume, not in armor penetration. The M2 sacrificed rate of fire for impact. Each round carried authority. Each hit had consequences beyond suppression. By late 1944, as Allied forces crossed into Germany, the vulnerability of lightly armored assets became increasingly apparent. Retreating units struggled to move equipment under constant threat of air attack and ground interdiction. American columns equipped with heavy machine guns could establish temporary strongpoints that controlled roads and intersections. Armor, it turned out, was relative. Thick frontal plating on heavy tanks could withstand most .50 caliber fire, but flanks, vision ports, tracks, and supporting vehicles remained exposed. War is rarely fought tank against tank alone. It is fought through supply, communication, and maneuver, and in those areas, the M2 exerted disproportionate influence. For German soldiers on the receiving end, the lesson was clear. Protection had limits. Steel did not guarantee safety. Distance did not guarantee safety. Cover did not guarantee safety. The heavy crack of .50 caliber fire signaled more than incoming rounds. It signaled vulnerability. In the evolving mechanized battlefield of World War II, mobility and light protection were essential for speed. But against the power of the M2 Browning, that balance often tipped toward exposure. Armor, in many cases, was simply not enough.
By the final years of World War II, the M2 Browning had already earned a reputation for raw battlefield power. But alongside its proven effectiveness grew something else: rumors, myths, and a darker narrative that traveled through trenches, tank columns, and prisoner-of-war camps. Among German troops, stories began to circulate that the American .50 caliber was inhumane. Some claimed it was too destructive to be used against personnel. Others insisted it violated international law. These rumors spread quickly in a war already saturated with propaganda, fear, and misinformation. The origin of this belief likely stemmed from the visible effects of the weapon. The .50 caliber BMG round was designed not just for infantry suppression, but for anti-aircraft and anti-material roles. When used against equipment or vehicles, its power was obvious. When used against personnel in open combat, the impact was devastating. Wounds caused by high-velocity, heavy rounds were catastrophic compared to those from standard rifle ammunition. To soldiers witnessing such injuries, the difference felt extreme. In close combat, perception shapes memory, and memory shapes rumor. However, there was no international ban on the use of .50 caliber machine guns against enemy soldiers. The Hague Conventions regulated certain types of munitions, such as expanding bullets, but they did not prohibit heavy machine gun fire against personnel. The M2 was a lawful military weapon, widely recognized as such. Yet, in the chaos of war, legality mattered less than fear. German troops facing American armored units quickly learned that the .50 caliber could reach them at distances where their own rifles were ineffective. When pinned down by sustained heavy fire, some described feeling helpless. The weapon's deep, methodical rhythm reinforced the sense that something powerful and unstoppable was directed at them. Psychology became part of the battlefield equation. American tank crews sometimes used short bursts of .50 caliber fire not only to engage targets, but to discourage movement. The sound alone, loud, sharp, and heavier than most machine guns, could freeze enemy troops in place. In urban fighting or forest engagements, its echo amplified the intimidation. Captured German soldiers occasionally told interrogators that they feared being targeted by the big American gun. Some believed that American gunners deliberately used it against infantry to maximize destruction. In reality, battlefield decisions were driven by tactical necessity. If enemy forces were operating vehicles, weapons, or fortified positions, they were legitimate military targets, regardless of caliber. But myths grow fastest in uncertainty. There were also exaggerated stories that American forces preferred the .50 caliber because it caused more suffering. No evidence supports such claims. The M2 was valued for its range, reliability, and versatility. In many cases, it was the most effective tool available to neutralize a threat quickly, reducing prolonged exchanges of fire. Ironically, the same qualities that fueled rumors also saved lives. By engaging enemy positions at long range, American units often prevented closer, bloodier confrontations. A convoy halted by accurate .50 caliber fire might surrender rather than attempt a suicidal charge. Aircraft deterred by defensive heavy machine guns might break off attacks before inflicting further casualties. Yet the reputation of the weapon darkened further as propaganda intensified on both sides. Nazi propaganda outlets portrayed Allied weapons as excessively brutal in an attempt to strengthen domestic resolve. Highlighting the destructive capability of American heavy machine guns fit this narrative. At the same time, Allied forces emphasized the technological superiority of their arms, reinforcing the image of overwhelming firepower. Between these competing messages, the truth became blurred. Another myth claimed that targeting soldiers with .50 caliber rounds was somehow different from targeting equipment. This idea likely grew from post-war misunderstandings and anecdotal storytelling. In practice, combat rarely offered such distinctions. If enemy forces were operating vehicles, weapons, or fortified positions, they were legitimate military targets regardless of caliber. Veterans on both sides later reflected that fear often magnified perception. In the heat of battle, the sound of a weapon could loom larger than its statistics. The MG-42 terrified Allied soldiers with its rapid, tearing sound. The M2 instilled dread through its power and impact. Each side developed its own psychological associations. For German soldiers in particular, the growing dominance of Allied air and ground forces contributed to the M2's mythic status. It seemed to appear everywhere, on tanks, on jeeps, in bomber turrets, on naval ships. Its presence symbolized American industrial might. Facing it was not just confronting a weapon, but confronting the scale of the Allied war machine. And scale affects morale. By 1945, as Germany's position deteriorated, stories about American firepower, including the .50 caliber, circulated widely among retreating units. Fear mixed with exhaustion. Defeat amplified legend. What may have begun as battlefield observation hardened into belief. In reality, the M2 Browning was neither unlawful nor uniquely cruel. It was a tool, engineered for durability and effectiveness in a mechanized war. Its destructive capability was significant, but no more so than many other weapons deployed during the conflict. Still, perception is powerful. The dark reputation of the M2 Browning was born not solely from what it did, but how it was experienced. To those on the receiving end, the difference between suppression and devastation could feel enormous. The heavy crack of each round carried weight beyond physics. It carried symbolism. It symbolized reach. It symbolized power. And for many German soldiers, it symbolized the growing realization that the balance of the war was shifting. In the end, the myths surrounding the M2 reveal as much about the psychology of warfare as they do about the weapon itself. Fear spreads faster than facts. Stories endure longer than reports. And on the battlefields of World War II, the legend of the American .50 caliber became almost as formidable as its firepower. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, countless weapons were retired, replaced, or forgotten. Tanks became obsolete. Aircraft were scrapped. Entire arsenals were redesigned for a new nuclear age. Yet one weapon refused to disappear. The M2 Browning did not fade into history. It remained. By the end of World War II, hundreds of thousands of M2 machine guns had been produced. They had served on ships in the Atlantic, bombers over Europe, tanks in North Africa, and landing craft in the Pacific. Soldiers who had relied on them trusted their durability. Commanders valued their versatility. Logisticians appreciated their standardized ammunition. But perhaps most importantly, the M2 had proven adaptable.
When the Korean War erupted in 1950, the battlefield once again demanded long-range defensive firepower. Frozen hills, open valleys, and defensive perimeters made heavy machine guns essential. The M2 returned to combat, mounted on vehicles and fixed positions. In sub-zero temperatures, it continued to function, provided crews maintained proper head spacing and timing. Reports from Korea echoed those from World War II. The weapon was heavy, but it was dependable. A decade later in Vietnam, the M2 adapted to a very different environment. Dense jungles and guerrilla tactics defined the conflict. American convoys moving along narrow roads were vulnerable to ambush. The solution often involved mounting M2 machine guns on trucks, creating heavily armed convoy escorts. These vehicles, sometimes called gun trucks, used .50 caliber fire to break ambushes and suppress enemy positions quickly. In this new kind of war, the M2 once again demonstrated why it endured. Its range allowed gunners to engage threats before they closed distance. Its power penetrated light cover. And its unmistakable report, deep, deliberate, and commanding, remained a psychological tool as much as a physical one. Technological advances did not render it obsolete. Instead, they enhanced it. Improved mounting systems, optical sights, and later thermal imaging expanded its capabilities. Variants were developed for aircraft, naval vessels, and armored vehicles. The heavy barrel configuration introduced before World War II became standard, allowing sustained fire with reduced overheating. Even as lighter automatic weapons entered service, none fully replaced the M2's role. Medium machine guns offered portability, but not the same anti-material capability. Automatic grenade launchers provided explosive firepower, but lacked the same flat trajectory and precision at long range. The M2 occupied a unique space, powerful enough to disable vehicles, accurate enough for controlled bursts, and rugged enough to survive decades of use. Its longevity is extraordinary. Designed in the aftermath of World War I, refined in the interwar years, and blooded in World War II, it remains in service more than a century after its creation. Few military weapons in history can claim such continuity. The reason lies in fundamentals. The .50 BMG cartridge delivers a balance of velocity, mass, and penetration that remains relevant even in modern warfare. Lightly armored vehicles still exist. Aircraft still fly low. Defensive perimeters still require long-range coverage. The basic problems of warfare, mobility, protection, and firepower have not changed as technology might suggest. Veterans from multiple generations share similar stories about the weapon. World War II tank commanders, Korean War infantrymen, Vietnam convoy gunners, and modern service members often describe the same qualities: reliability, authority, and confidence. There is also symbolism attached to it. On armored vehicles, the silhouette of the M2 mounted above a turret has become iconic. It represents presence, it signals strength. In military culture, it carries heritage, a direct link to earlier generations who carried the same steel into different wars. Yet its legacy is not only about admiration, it also carries the weight of its reputation. The fear it inspired during World War II never fully disappeared. Stories of its power passed through decades of service. In every conflict where it appeared, opponents learned quickly to respect it. Light vehicles kept distance, fighters avoided predictable attack runs, infantry sought deeper cover. The same qualities that unsettled German troops in the 1940s continued to shape tactical decisions long after. Still, the M2's endurance is not accidental nostalgia. Military procurement is driven by necessity, not sentiment. Weapons that fail are replaced. Systems that underperform are retired. The M2 remained because it worked. Its design,
simple, robust, and mechanically sound, allowed incremental modernization without abandoning the core platform. New materials improved barrels. Safer quick-change barrel systems were introduced, yet the operating principle remained rooted in the original genius of John Browning. Few designers create something that outlives them by a century in active military service. Browning did. From the beaches of Normandy to the mountains of Korea, from the jungles of Vietnam to modern armored convoys, the M2 Browning has been present. It has witnessed the transformation of warfare, from propeller-driven aircraft to jets, from analog radios to satellite communications. And still, when mounted and loaded, it performs the same essential function it was designed for, delivering powerful, controlled, long-range fire. In the end, the legacy of the M2 is not merely that it was feared. Many weapons inspire fear in their time. The difference is durability, mechanical, tactical, and psychological. The M2 Browning endured because it answered a fundamental requirement of modern war. It bridged generations, it adapted without losing identity, and more than 100 years after its conception, its heavy, deliberate report still echoes across training grounds and battlefields alike. What began as a response to the lessons of World War I became one of the most enduring weapons in military history, a legacy forged in steel, sustained by necessity, and remembered by all who have heard its unmistakable sound.